It is really good to welcome you tonight to our Wednesday evening service at the Smyrna Church of Christ in Cookeville, Tennessee. We're delighted you're joining us, whether by Facebook or YouTube, or whether you're in the parking lot, and especially for those of you who are inside. We are thrilled to have you as a part of our class tonight. We are studying the 40th chapter of the book of Genesis, and we are proceeding with our study of Joseph. If this is the first time you've joined us, let me remind you that Jehovah saw the need to remove Jacob's family from the land of Canaan. One of the reasons was the Canaanite influence was having an impact on that family. We see that especially with Judah in Genesis 38 and with other members of the family. Joseph becomes the channel through which Jehovah will move the family of Jacob to Egypt. And there he will build a nation. 70 souls will go into Egypt. You'll read that in Exodus chapter 1. And more than 2 million, known as the nation of Israel, will come out of Egypt. This is all working out a plan that Jehovah revealed to Abraham in Genesis 15. That his seed would go into a foreign nation, and there they would be servants. Jehovah would then judge that nation, and the seed of Abraham would come out. That prepared us in Genesis 15 for the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and as we have it, Numbers and Deuteronomy. Had things gone as Jehovah intended for them to go, at Numbers 14, they would have occupied the land of Canaan. Having occupied that land, the rest of what we know as the Pentateuch would have read differently. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy was necessitated because of what takes place at Numbers 13 and 14. So with chapter 40, we have Joseph being sold into slavery into Egypt at 17 years of age, chapter 39. 4 times in chapter 39, we reiterate the phrase, Jehovah was with Joseph. If you're reading from the New King James or another modern speech translation, or the King James Version, you will have the word Lord, but it's in all capital letters. Very likely the preface to your translation will explain to you that that references what is called the Tetragrammaton, 4 consonants in the Hebrew that have to do with the covenant name of God introduced in Exodus chapter 3, and thus translated with a hybrid word, Jehovah. But when you see Lord in all caps or God in all caps in the King James, New King James, ESV, that references that covenant name, that memorial name, by which Jehovah operated with the nation of Israel. We introduced the first 4 verses last time in Genesis 40 under the heading, The 2 Inmates. The chief of the butlers and the chief of the bakers offended, and that's a Hebrew word that means incurred guilt, before the king of Egypt, before Pharaoh. We are not told what they did. But the king put them into Potiphar's prison. Now when you go back to your notes on Genesis 39, you will remember that Potiphar was chief of the executioners, which means he was over in our vernacular death row, where the king's prisoners were placed. Because Jehovah had been with Joseph, Potiphar's house had prospered greatly under Joseph's management, until Mrs. Potiphar lied about him, and then he was put into Potiphar's prison. 2 times in the prison, we learn Jehovah was with Joseph. And the keeper of the prison put everything under Joseph's management. So when the king's chief butler and chief baker were thrown into this prison, they were placed under the care of Joseph. And they become a stepping stone to the advancement of Joseph from the prison. We learned something about Pharaoh. We had learned about Potiphar that when Mrs. Potiphar lied about Joseph, that he was angry, he was wroth. His anger boiled over. We do not know at whom. It's my speculation it was at Mrs. Potiphar, but we'll have to get to heaven to know for sure. But here, Pharaoh burst out in rage, is what that word wrath means, with these two officers. The word officer there is the same word translated or used of Potiphar. It can be translated eunuch or officer. The context has to tell us what the word means in that particular setting. And so they're in the prison where Joseph is, and they are under the charge of the captain of the guard, who is Potiphar. The captain of the guard, in turn, puts them in Joseph's care, and Joseph ministered to. And we mentioned that in the Septuagint translation, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, made beginning about the 200s BC, under Ptolemy Philadelphus, and then continuing for a number of years under the auspices of 70 scholars, uses the Greek word pareste, which means to stand by the side of. So Joseph stood by the side of the chief butler and the chief baker. He served them or ministered to them or took care of them. The Hebrew word that's used for minister, shalrath, refers to a higher level of service, not the menial task of a slave. And we find that as Joseph exercised his responsibility in the prison, that he was faithful in his duty, both to the captain of the guard and in the form of the chief butler and the chief baker to his fellow men. I'm saying that because I want us to reiterate that trait of Joseph. He was faithful to Potiphar, even though Mrs. Potiphar accused him of being unfaithful. He is now faithful to the keeper of the prison. Faithful. Now that's interesting. Because you'll remember 2 times in the 25th chapter of the book of Matthew, Jesus illustrated the one who would go to heaven by the 5-talent and 2-talent men, and to each of them it was said, "Well done, good and faithful servant." You will also remember in Revelation 2 and 10 to the church at Smyrna, John wrote, as Jesus dictates, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." So this avenue of faithfulness, we saw it in Abraham, we saw it in Noah, we saw it in Enoch, we saw it in Seth, we saw it in Abel. And thus, all the way through, we are looking at this idea of faithful. Jehovah's people are to serve Him faithfully. And that idea permeates your Old Testament, permeates the New Testament, and is that which determines our relationship to God. God never asked me to be sinless because He knew that was an impossibility. John stated that in 1 John chapter 2, verse 1 as the ideal. When he said, "My little children, these things I write unto you, in order that no man sin." And the Greek word there means do not commit a single act of sin. But none of us is able to do that. So John went on to write, "And if anyone sins." Now there's reality. We have an advocate, a defense attorney with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. And He is the propitiation, the suitable substitute offering that meets the demands of violated justice. He is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but for the whole world, the entirety of the world. So we look at this idea of faithfulness. Now, this continued for a season, but we do not know how long a season is. So here you have an indefinite period of time. Some have speculated, we'll have to get to heaven to know for sure, that it entailed an entire year, that these men were in prison. Since both of these positions we mentioned involved the king's food and drink, and we know in Genesis 39:6 that Potiphar had put everything under Joseph's care except the food that he ate. And thus you would have the chief butler and the chief baker dealing with the food of Pharaoh. And their offense may very well have had something to do with that. And we see then this being involved. Maybe Pharaoh feared that they would poison him. And we talked about how particular those in the Secret Service have to be with the food of the president. Often the news media, and if you want to call it that, stages various shots. And you will have a candidate in a restaurant here or there, and they're eating or drinking. You see, often that doesn't happen. They're just moving around. Back in the days of handshaking, y'all remember that, in the days of Abraham? Back in the days of Abraham, the handshaking, they're just shaking hands and politicking. But if they eat anything, you can be sure, as far as the president's concerned, it has been checked very thoroughly. And this may be the offense. We'll have to get to heaven to know for sure. So we have the two inmates. In verses 5 to 8, we have what I call the troubling dreams. And that takes us back to Genesis 37 in ideology. Remember, Joseph had two dreams. And as a result of those two dreams, his brothers hated him, could not even say shalom to him, and that ended in his being sold into slavery. So in verse 5, the text says, "Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation." So here's a dream taking place. And when Joseph comes in the next day, he notices something. "And Joseph came in to them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad." And I believe I had underscored for your thinking two words in verse 6. He looked and he saw, which indicates the attitude of heart of Joseph, how careful he was in the carrying out of his duties. Joseph notices something about these two prisoners. Now, if you are a jailer and prisoners are put under your care, then you are responsible for their welfare. And if there's a problem, then you need to know it as soon as possible so that you may remedy it, if there's something you may remedy. So he is acutely aware of what's going on. He's attuned to these prisoners. And he sees these men different than they have been. And by implication here, you have the idea that up until this period of time, regardless of their disposition, they had not exhibited this kind of a sadness. Now, we must never lose sight of the fact that being in prison is not fun. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we lose sight of that with Joseph. Because Jehovah was with him and made everything he did prosper, and they turned the prison over to him, sometimes we get the idea that that lessened what being in prison meant. Don't get that idea. it was still a bad place to be. And Joseph did not want to be there, and the butler and the baker did not want to be there. No matter how well Joseph treated them, they wanted to have their freedom. So he asked, verse 7, Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his Lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" Notice your preposition. They were having the same status applied to them as Joseph was, even though Joseph was in charge. Notice they were with him in custody, in the prison, which indicates they stood on the same footing as far as their freedom was concerned. We don't need to lose sight of that. And so he says, "Why do you look so sad today?" And I mentioned to you Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 2, where Nehemiah, the cupbearer to Artaxerxes, the king of Persia, was sad. And the king noticed that and said, "Why are you sad?" Nehemiah told him about the dilapidated state of the city wall in Jerusalem and of the temple. And Artaxerxes was willing to send him back to repair that. And so you had the seeing of his sadness. And I had mentioned how careful are we at watching people. And I believe our assignment for this past week was to look at people, watch people, look at their faces, and see what you see. And if you'll get out a sheet of paper and write your answers to that quiz, I'll grade it and give it back to you. But we need to be aware of other people. Sometimes, as Christians, we can get caught up in ourselves, can't we? And totally ignore people around us who may need a good word, a smile, something pleasant said. A lot of people are hurting. And we need to understand that just because someone's in a crowd doesn't mean they're not lonely. And just because someone is smiling or laughing does not mean they're happy. Some people hide it really well. They hide the fact they're struggling deeply. And so you and I need to be attuned to people and notice them. It may open a door to evangelism, open a door to salvation, just because we spoke a word or noticed that they were sad. So in verse 8, they answered Joseph's inquiry. They said to him, "We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it." So Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please." Or, if you're reading from the Old King James language, "I pray thee." So Joseph asks, and they answer. They dreamed a dream, and there was no one to interpret. If you look at your notes, that's from a Hebrew word pathar, which means to open up. The dream is closed up as far as their understanding what it means. And to interpret the dream is to open it up so they understand the meaning. One writer said the Hebrew sentence, order, in the first two clauses throws the emphatic word forward. Thus, a dream we have dreamed, and an interpreter none. Notice the emphasis is on the dream. And this is a tie-in principle to chapter 37. We dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter. Now you will remember in Joseph's dream, he interpreted it. And he told his brothers they would bow down to him, or implied that. And his father and mother would join them in doing that. So here are dreams. Now notice what Joseph says. Do not interpretations belong to God? This implied Joseph is God's representative. because he says, tell them to me. So, implication here ties those two together. Interpretations belong to God. Tell them to me. Implied, I am God's representative. And you have the same thing with Daniel. There's so many parallels with Joseph and Daniel in the palace of a king. If you'll turn to Daniel 2, and we're a long way removed from Joseph in Daniel 2. We're in the time of the Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar the king is on the throne. He's in the second year of his reign. In the first year, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, among others, were taken to Babylon, 605 BC. In the second year, 604 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. So he awakened, and he couldn't go back to sleep. He was troubled by what he had dreamed. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. Now, those words are all representative, they're synonymous, of a class of people. The word in the Greek that we will meet later on in the birth of Jesus in Luke is magi, the wise men. And when Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and Daniel were taken captive, they were put into school for 3 years to become wise men, to be able to interpret dreams. So when he calls these magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, and Chaldeans, he's also calling Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are not in the group that comes. And the king says, I've had a dream, and my spirit is troubled, is anxious, to understand the dream. The Chaldean spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. That's how you address the king. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. Now, if you're looking carefully at verse 4 of Daniel 2, that's how it usually worked. You tell the dream, we'll tell you what it means. That's not how it's going to work. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, circle, coordinating conjunction, that joins things of equal rank, and its interpretation. Now, when you are dealing with Mark 16:16 with people in a Bible study, and they say to you, all one has to do to be saved is believe, because he said in the second clause of that verse, he who disbelieves shall be condemned. You will want to point out that coordinating conjunction between believe and be baptized. He who believes and a coordinating conjunction, joins things of equal rank, equal standing, is baptized. Now, if you know that little simple understanding of English language, English grammar, it can help you help someone see the truth. But if they get bowed up over that and defensive, come back for an illustration to Daniel 2:5 and ask, would Nebuchadnezzar have been happy if the servants had only told the dream? Or would Nebuchadnezzar have been happy if the servants had only given the interpretation? You see that and? Sometimes in Bible reading we just right on by important words. But every word in the Bible is important. And most of them stress something for us. And if you don't do that, he says, you shall be cut in pieces, your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Then look at the conclusion word. Do all of you have a therefore there? Conclusion word. Therefore tell me the dream and its interpretation. They answered again, "Tell us the dream, we will give the interpretation." And the king sees through that fluff in verse 8, and he says, "You're stalling. If you do not make known to me the dream, there's only one decree for you. Because I know that I can't trust your interpretation." Verse 10, they said, "There's not a man on earth." Now, I don't have time to teach you the book of Daniel. You may not be alive if I have time to get there. I may not be alive, so I want to teach you this here. What did Joseph say? "Do not dreams belong to God?" What did these Chaldeans say? "There's not a man," the key word there is man. "There's not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter." But there is a God in heaven. Keep that in mind. So the king was angry, verse 12, and very furious. Now, being angry and very furious is past run-of-the-mill anger. And he gave the command to destroy, look at your big little word, all the wise men. Now that would be Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, as well as these fellows. So the decree goes out. And they sought, now the first time Daniel and those three Hebrews come into play is verse 13. They sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree from the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time, that he might tell the king the interpretation. Now that, by implication, shows you he was not in the original group. Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that they might, now look at verse 18. Notice what those men have said in verse 10. "There's not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter." They took it to a higher level. That they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Now notice verse 19. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. See that then? Do you all have a then there? Notice your order. They prayed then. They took it to God then. God answered prayer. And Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And he gives that great blessing. So Daniel goes in verse 24 to Arioch. And he said, "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation." Wait a minute. There's a coordinating conjunction involved in that, isn't there? Where's the dream? Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, "I found a man of the," do you have captives? Yes. Or the captivity, some translations. Notice, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah have been promoted in chapter 1 over all these folks, but they're still slaves. "Of Judah, who will make known to the king the interpretation." Where's the dream? The king answered and said to Daniel, notice, Daniel, now we're going to look at it from a Babylonian standpoint, whose name, Belteshazzar, Babylonian, not a compliment. "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I've seen and its interpretation?" Notice Nebuchadnezzar didn't get sidetracked. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king." Now he reiterates what they said in verse 10. Now do you have my favorite coordinating conjunction in verse 28? You'd want to circle that. "But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days, your dream and the visions of your of your head upon your bed were these. And then he tells the dream and the interpretation. I want you to zero in on verse 28 with Joseph in chapter 40 and verse 8. Do not interpretations belong to God? There is not a man alive on the earth who can do this. So this implied Joseph is God's representative. Notice how careful he is to explain that he cannot interpret the dream. Now this opens the door. And with Joseph, from Genesis 37 and then 39 to 50, you're looking for open doors of evangelism. If you want a tremendous Old Testament example under patriarchy of evangelism among the Gentiles, Joseph is your man. So you're looking for an open door. And this opens the door for him to introduce God to these people. God was the source. His servant was the channel of the interpretation. And what you need to underscore with this has always been God's method to reveal His will. God has always gone through a channel in the revelation of His message. It may have been a dream, it may have been a vision, it may have been a prophet. It may have been a Joseph. It may have been a Philip in Acts 8, or a group of apostles in Acts 2, or Peter in Acts 10, or Paul and Silas, Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey, Paul and Silas on the last two and the journey to Rome, but through a medium. And it's interesting that to us, first to the disciples and then to us by implication, go into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. Mark 16:15. We're the medium through which God's revelation is to be made known. So Joseph says, God's the source, I'm the medium. I'm God's representative. Notice he's giving the credit to God, not taking it for himself. And notice that God is real to Joseph in every situation in which we find him. My God is real. Is yours? I'm convinced a lot of people have an imaginary God. That they have a God when it's convenient, but when they get into trouble, they're on their own. Everyone in the Old Testament who worshipped idolatry was in that fix. They had a God when everything was going well. When things were going wrong, all they could do was kill people to try to sacrifice to that God, to appease that anger. And the songwriter hit it on the head. We miss it. We miss the punctuation in this song, I am convinced. Living below in this old sinful world, hardly a comfort can afford. There's a comma there in my judgment that shouldn't be there. That which affords the comfort, according to the songwriter, is living in this sinful world. There's no comfort in that. Striving alone to face temptation sore. And then he asks that question, where could I go but to the Lord? Now these two men are sad. They need help. Joseph said, the only place you can go is to God. Because dreams belong to God. Now I think I mentioned last time that dreams got Joseph into trouble in chapter 37. If I had been Joseph, I might have said, I don't want anything to do with dreams. I've had all the dreams I can stand. I'm in here because of dreams. Don't talk to me about dreams. But Joseph may, we'll have to get to heaven to know. You may see Joseph's understanding opening here. That he's moved to begin to understand that he's not in that prison because of his dreams. And before you get through with Joseph, you'll see him fully understand, if I'm correct in reading these remaining chapters, that it was the character of his brothers that caused him to be sold into slavery, not his dreams. But be that as it is, even in prison, Joseph did not forget God, but he continued to present God to the people in Egypt. And my way of saying it is, from the time Joseph's foot hit Egyptian soil until the time they put him in a coffin in Egypt, Genesis 50, he introduced the people of Egypt to God. He never quit talking about God. I need to look at my life and ask, do I have a hard time talking to people about God? I can talk about football, baseball, fishing, golf, hunting, badminton, tennis. Can I talk about God? How many boys and girls know Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, but they don't know Jesus? Joseph never quit talking about God. And he's introducing these people, these Gentiles, to the God of the Hebrews, Jehovah. So in verses 9 to 23, we have Joseph's faithful, underscore that word, interpretations. I'm stressing Joseph's faithfulness all the way through. I gave you some quotes that underscored the idea of the importance of dreams in Egypt. The Egyptians, one writer said, placed a great deal of emphasis upon dreams. The thing they placed a great deal of emphasis upon becomes the market avenue God uses as a means of introducing himself into Egypt as the market, true, and the living God. And if you take notes on your notes, as opposed to idolatry. And at the same time of enabling Joseph to reach the place where he is needed in Egypt to serve God and help Jacob's descendants grow into a nation. So, if you were wanting to write a capsule idea in verse 1, or in number 1 under 8, it would be this: God's method to accomplish his purpose. God's method to accomplish his purpose. And here you see providence. Another writer said how seriously the Egyptians took their dreams and how earnestly they tried to make sense from them. We know from a papyrus document preserved from this general period. It is a catalog of possible subjects that might occur in dreams together with their significance. So you might say it's the wise man's playbook. Thus, according to this lore, to dream of white bread meant good fortune. I can agree with that. To dream of a pain in the side meant the loss of some possession. And so on. Most of these interpretations were based on word plays. Of course, you understand when you dream of white bread, it has a cheeseburger in between each piece. Those who interpreted dreams in Egypt were specialists who consulted dream books. And examples have been discovered by the archaeologists. Now, those dream books, when you get to Acts 19 and you have Paul in Ephesus and he's dealing with the magicians, he's dealing with the magic there, and when those people are converted and then they realize, hey, we've been converted, we can't hold on to these magic books and keep reading that and thinking we can practice that. They had a bonfire at Ephesus in Acts 19, and the text uses the progressive tense, the present tense in the Greek. that carries with the idea they kept on bringing their books and they kept on throwing them onto the fire. So there must have been quite a collection of these magical formula books in Ephesus among those people. Well, these interpreters had the dream books. And that's why the wise men to Nebuchadnezzar said, tell us the dream, we'll interpret it for you. We'll go pull our books down and we'll find the interpretation that fits that dream. But when they didn't have the dream, their books didn't help them. And so in verses 9 to 15, we have the interpretation of the chief butler's dream. In 9, 10, and 11, we have the rehearsal of the dream. Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, behold, in my dream a vine was before me. Notice, butler, vine. And in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded. Its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. Notice, butler, vine, cup. And I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Notice the work of the chief butler was to serve the drink to Pharaoh. And the drink consisted of grape juice. So he saw a grapevine, 3 branches. He saw the 3 branches bud, blossom, and produce grapes in its cluster. He saw Pharaoh's cup in his hand. And he took the grapes and squeezed out the juice into the cup and served the grape juice to Pharaoh. And the way he did that was he placed the cup, verse 11, in Pharaoh's hand. Notice, everything was done in Pharaoh's presence. And those who write of this say, in Pharaoh's presence, the cup was washed, the grapes were squeezed, the juice went into the cup, and then the cup was handed to Pharaoh. He observed all of it. The word hand here is from a Hebrew word that means the hollow of the hand, or the palm. The Hebrew references placing the cup on Pharaoh's palm. The hollow of the hand, produced by bending the fingers inward. And the Hebrews always spoke of placing the cup in a person's hands. Look at Psalms 75. Verse 8. For in the hand of Jehovah a cup, and the wine is red. It is fully mixed, and he pours it out. Surely its dregs shall all the wicked of the earth drain and drink down. Notice the cup is in his hand. Go to Jeremiah chapter 51. Look at verse 7. Babylon was a golden cup in Jehovah's hand that made all the earth drunk. The nations drank her wine. Therefore the nations are drained. Notice, in the hand. Go to Ezekiel 23. Verse 31. You have walked in the way of your sister, therefore I will put her cup in your hand. So Joseph here uses, though he may be speaking Egyptian, uses a Hebrew idiom, saying you will give the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Now, little C I mentioned to you, Rawlinson at one time said that Herodotus, the father of ancient history, denied the existence of grapes in Egypt. Archaeologists have since found that grapes did exist in Egypt. Now, be careful. Do not ever say archaeology proved the Bible right. The Bible was right all along. Archaeology just caught up with it. And so Joseph hears that dream. In verses 12 and 13, you have the response of Joseph. And Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it." Now, if you mark in your Bible, in verse 8, you marked interpretations belong to God. In verse 12, mark, "This is the interpretation," connect the two. Since Joseph is able to give the interpretation, you have here the implied knowledge that Joseph is the channel through whom Jehovah is working, God is working. This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, according to the former manner when you were his butler. Look at that terminology. Pharaoh will lift up your head. And here it means, and notice our big major Bible study term, context. Here it means restore you to your position. But you want to let a little caution light go off that says, don't assume, you know what that'll do to you, that it means that everywhere it's used. Context has to determine that. So you will be restored to your former position. I think we have time to look at 2 Kings chapter 25 and verse 27. This is Jehoiakim being released from prison. And it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th of the month, Evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, released Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. Some translations have lifted up his head out of prison. And there it was a restoration out of the prison. Thank you for being part of our class tonight. We encourage you to join us again next week as we again study the